Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Kelly Palmer.
Good morning. I'm Kayla David.
Welcome, everyone, to Be Well Live. If this is your first time joining us, we are very happy to have you. Kayla and I are part of the healing department at Family Service of Rhode Island, and we come together every other week as part of our information series, Be Well Live, where we discuss various topics related to how we are all coping during this COVID-19 pandemic. For those of you who don't know, Family Service of Rhode Island is a behavioral health and social service agency, and we've been serving Rhode Island for a really long time, over about 125 years. And we offer a variety of services, including telehealth counseling.
So, we will be joining together today and every other Wednesday at 10 a.m. for discussions that support wellness during COVID-19. We ask that you please take a moment to share this with your friends or to start a watch party. Help us reach as many as we can with this important information about being well during COVID-19. Now more than ever, it is so important for us to be able to reach out when we're struggling or to help our loved ones be able to connect with assistance if they're struggling. COVID-19 has put a tremendous amount of stress on all of us in so many ways, and it's impacting not only our physical health, but our well-being and our mental health.
So, Kayla, I think it was just a few days ago that it was the year anniversary of the first COVID-19 case here in Rhode Island.
Mm-hmm.
And, as I'm reflecting and I'm thinking about where we all started on this pandemic journey, initially, I think, of course, none of us knew what was ahead of us. And we were preparing, I think, to be, in quarantine or isolation for a few weeks. And then the few weeks became a few months. And, here we are. So there's been shutdowns and closures. I think we've all gotten used to social distancing, and when you're out and about seeing little circles or X's about where to stand and wearing our masks, you know. And, a year ago, we were really talking about, I remember my son being home and not going home back to school or having a spring break early. And we were talking about, oh, this is just going to be a few weeks, right? We need like 14 days to flatten the curve. Um, and here we are a year later, right? So what was thought to be something that we were going to have to cope with in the short term has really become this long lasting thing that we're all having to cope with. And it's lasted much longer than I think we all thought it would.
Yeah. And I think, Sarah, one of the things is I was even reading this morning about the idea of going back to normal, right? This has changed us. There
Mm-hmm.
is no going back to before the pandemic. The pandemic has changed our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with other people. It has changed
Sure.
our communities. And with no definitive end in sight, what we're finding now is that many people are experiencing what we're calling and would have never talked about before pandemic fatigue, COVID fog, or what people are also calling quarantine burnout. And that's kind of really what we're going to talk about today. It's the collective exhaustion that comes from months of responding to all the stressors that come with this virus. Pandemic fatigue, that's what we're going to call it for this segment, can leave us feeling just that, fatigued. It is slow moving. So it's been impacting all of us in different ways throughout the course of this pandemic. However, it can often feel like it's come out of nowhere. And
Mm-hmm.
today we'll be talking about the symptoms of pandemic fatigue and then small ways we can begin to combat it or at least try to mitigate or manage what's going on for each and every one of us.
Yes, and I think we all can relate to this idea of pandemic fatigue, Kayla. I saw a meme the other day online where it was like, one moment I'm baking banana bread, I'm wallpapering my living room, I'm living my best life. And then the next day I feel like I can't get out of bed and I'm in my pajamas for 2 days. So, it's that like these highs and lows that we're all
Yeah.
having. And I think first and foremost, it's really important to highlight that you are not alone. And, you and I do a lot of education and talk about traumatic events and stressful life events. And, this is one that truly has been a collective experience, right? So we are not alone. We are all kind of going through this together. And, today we're going to talk specifically about some of the symptoms of pandemic fatigue. And many of us, including I know myself, can identify one, if not more than one of these things that many of us are experiencing on a daily basis, right? And I think when I think about pandemic fatigue, the first thing that people often notice, and that I really noticed, particularly this past week, was that every day feels the same,
Mhm.
you know? And I think pre-pandemic, of course, we had routines and rhythms to our day, but this is different, right? Our day to day really doesn't have the variety that it used to because in some instances it just can't, right? Um, Many of us, whether we're working from home or not, are spending a lot more time like staring at the same walls, right? I mean, whether it's moving from one room to the other, we're staring at those same walls day to day. Um, and I think, that leads to us really missing other outlets or activities that typically would help us cope. And for me, it's the idea of I think I've lost some of that spontaneity, right? So,
Mhm.
like, we have to be so much more planful now so that you kind of lose that ability to be spontaneous.
Yeah.
But if you can, it's really important to try to almost force yourself to do things to shake things up or to be spontaneous, right? So I know I recently had a couple days off of work, which was wonderful. But the first morning I woke up and I thought to myself, maybe I should have just worked today. Because honestly, Kayla, it was like, well, what am I gonna do? It's
Yeah.
COVID-19. So I really had to force myself to think out of the box and to do things different, you know. So I think whether it's taking a drive to a new place, making an effort to see friends or family outdoors or however you are comfortable, just finding a safe way to get away, to get beyond those walls that you're staring at, right? Day in and day out, even if it's just for an afternoon or a couple hours. Um, Change up your routine. So I know, my family and I got into a habit of we would pick a show and watch a show together, which was fun and great. But, recently we've had to, like, flip that, and now we're playing different board games together, right? Just to make things not the same day to day. And
Yeah.
I think it's those small changes that can really make an impact and help to combat that fatigue of the same old, same old.
Yeah, I think, those small changes, Sarah, are so important. I mean, lately, my partner and I have been doing our grocery shopping at the farmers market here in Providence, and that's been a little bit different because we're able to see different things, new people.
Mhm.
It's shook it up because what was happening for us is that idea of like the weekends don't feel like any different than the weekdays. And so we needed to bring a little joy back into our weekend. So we started, even those small changes can have a big impact in kind of making things feel different. Or, Sarah, when you said the first day I was on vacation, I thought I should just be working. I mean, that's a huge part of this for people is we're just working all the time because what else is there to do?
Right.
And yet that is a very unhealthy practice long term that now it feels like all you're doing is working. You're working at night, you're working on the weekends.
Mhm.
We have to be so careful, even going back to some of our old, I was watching some of our old live streams the other day. We talked about boundaries, and I think we have to get back to that place where
Yes.
we're thinking about, okay, if this is possibly, if there's no end in sight for this, how do we put boundaries
Right.
back to some of those pieces, so even if we don't have a plan for what to do, we're not just jumping into the same thing, TV or work. which for many of us, it's work. In another way, the pandemic, has impacted us, and we can see pandemic fatigue for many people, is that it's harder to see the bigger picture, right? We're living moment to moment. So that idea of just, oh, I'll just get another thing, done at work, or,
Mhm.
I'm responding to this stressful situation and then this stressful situation. We're just living kind of moment to moment. And what can happen when we're doing that is when we don't kind of come up to breathe to say, oh, now I've worked, 7 days a week for the last 3 months, or whoa, I'm realizing that, all my life is work and TV,
Mhm.
which is it's for me. I'm saying that for me. Um, but we can also end up responding really emotionally to situations when we're living moment to moment. So we can lose or have a hard time empathizing or
Mm.
understanding other people's point of view. We can have a hard time problem solving. We can have a hard time feeling compassion for other people. We can be, in fact, the slow moving kind of experience that happens is we can be a lot more negative about other people, and that's coming from this place of kind of generalized fear about our safety, right? That can really generalize to being like,
Mm.
oh, other people are doing their jobs, or other people are doing all of these things that are against the rules, or down to the thing that you've now said to I was talking to someone the other day that said, every single day in the morning, I have to kind of list off things for my kid. Did they brush their teeth? Did they have their mask before they go to school? And she was saying, like, I even have a board right before we leave the house that says those things, and yet I still have to say it every single day.
Right.
And then that can be really emotionally draining. So one of the things to kind of combat that is to remember that we don't have to make all our decisions in that moment. It's important to recognize that we're making this split second decisions every millisecond, right? But we don't
Mhm.
actually have to make those big decisions if we're feeling emotional. So that ability to connect back into ourselves, to recognize, okay, I need to kind of come up out of this small moment to moment. Where am I emotionally? Am I feeling super drained? Am I feeling like I can respond to this in a way that's, empathetic, supportive, or in a way that's not really emotionally driven, and where I'm reacting out of my emotions. And if you can't, right, for kids, I do, red, yellow, green,
Mhm.
these, like, almost like a dartboard. If you're in the red or the yellow, you're saying, I am really going to make decisions based on emotion. So maybe I wait until I've done something that
Mhm.
brings me to that green place. And that leads to what you were saying earlier, Sarah, which is that we have to prioritize our self-care. And in those times when we're having a difficulty kind of coming out from that moment to moment, we're often not taking care of ourselves because we're
Right.
just dealing with what's right in front of us. So trying to prioritize things like 10 minutes for yourself a day, or even, I was reading something the other day to set like a little 15-minute alert, to just look out a window, because
Mm.
that can also reset your thought process beyond what's on your screen, right? That there's something bigger than what's right in front of you. Those are kind of tricks to kind of bring us out of that moment to moment response that we're really in right now.
I think that's so important, Kayla. And I think that, pre-pandemic, we all had everyday stressors, right? So even before this pandemic, it's safe to say that everyone had stress to deal with, right? And those stressors might look different for people. But I think when you layer on this pandemic on top of it, everybody's stress is just so much more kind of, it's times a thousand, right? And I know that for me, I've really seen that in myself, and that part of my pandemic fatigue um, is that I've really been experiencing this additional stress in a way that is making it really hard for me to concentrate, right? Um, and this is just another way that our brains kind of respond when we're experiencing a lot of stress, is that we begin to have trouble focusing, we begin to have trouble completing certain tasks. And, for those of us that maybe struggled with this prior to all this additional stress, think of that now, right? It's even harder to kind of hone in and focus and complete task. And I think even though you have to get something done, you might still struggle to do it, right? Um, and you might really do everything in your power to avoid that task, even though it's an important one to do. So if you think of an example, might be as simple as responding to an email, right? So even though it might seem like a really simple task, um, you know, just because of the amount of stress we're all experiencing, it can really feel impossible to do at the moment. So you kind of might put it off, right? And you put it off some more, and then the putting it off also can add stress to your situation. So that avoidance also equals more stress. And I think that when things are chronically stressful, we do try to avoid thinking about things that make us distressed because it is a coping mechanism, right? Um, but what can happen is then we live with like this stress all the time. So this is just something that I'm struggling with day to day. And I think it's really important to cope with this, that it can be really helpful to kind of look at our own expectations of ourselves and who is placing those expectations on us. And are these expectations kind of reality based? So I know, like for me, work and email is a big one. I feel if I don't respond immediately and I don't get that off my plate, it puts a lot of stress on me. So I'm really having to take a step back to take a breath, as you were saying before, to say, is that my expectation or is that someone else's? And usually it comes down to expectations I put on myself that aren't really reality based. And I have to kind of keep that in check. But really having trouble kind of completing tasks and focusing is, I think, just a symptom of this additional stress that we're kind of all going through together.
Well, and Sarah, it's so important, to recognize that that's not, I've heard a lot of people say, I'm lazy, my kid's lazy, right? Laziness is this big thing that we're talking about. This is a symptom of all of us living through a potentially traumatic event that has been chronically stressful. So when our bodies are living through something potentially traumatic and we are doing that for a long period of time, what happens is our body produces stress hormones. Those stress hormones were not meant to be being produced at this rate for this length of time. And so it's not that you're lazy, right? Like that's the big thing that I hope people get in the messaging from this show today, is that you are not lazy. This is an experience that people are having. It is not an uncommon experience that people are having. And it is a symptom of the toxic amount of stress that we're living in related to this pandemic. So, I mean, I think that that's so important because it allows us to be compassionate towards ourselves and compassionate towards other people, especially, our kids that are really struggling through this pandemic right now, because it's not that we're just lazy.
Yeah. I mean, we're in survival mode, if you think about it, big time. So yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah. And that's a huge part of any kind of ways of mitigating this, is just being able to acknowledge that this is not something inherent about us, right? That this is a symptom in relation to something extremely stressful that's going on. And because we're living that moment to moment, it can feel like we should have figured this out already.
Right. Yeah. It's hard.
Yeah. And another experience that many people are having related to pandemic fatigue is difficulty feeling pleasure in the things we used to enjoy. And this goes back to the same thing around that toxic level of stress hormones that we're experiencing. So when we're experiencing a lot of stress, we tend to experience big emotions related to those stressors. What can often happen because of all of that, stress, is that we have trouble recognizing smaller emotional experiences that we have throughout the day. So we get really, again, in this way, emotionally, we almost get big picture. We miss the little things. And so we can have that feeling of everything's the same, nothing is joyful, everything is bad. What we want to do is try to find those experiences that are less kind of big. So what I've been talking to people about is like kind of thinking about joy as a scale from 1 to 10, right? We can feel joy at a 10, that might be those big moments in our life of joy. But we also most days experience joys at 1s or 2s that we might not be kind of cueing into or recognizing. And we might not be being present for those moments because we're avoiding, because we're, distracting ourselves to cope. So, one of the things that I've been kind of telling people to do is, okay, what's a food that you love to eat, or, a thing that you really like to do, right? People will say, I really like chocolate. Okay, so take a piece of chocolate, eat that while being totally present with it, right? It's not like the joy, those big life joys, but
Right.
you probably are experiencing some level of joy or content at a 1, 2, or 3. Be present for those moments. Because of our phones, because we're coping through distraction, we often miss the little moments of joy, the feeling of the fresh air when we open the door, or even that hug, that long hug we get from someone in our household. There's all of this research that during a hug we release oxytocin, which is a hormone that relaxes us and lowers our anxiety. They call it the cuddle hormone. And when it's released during a 20-second hug, it actually physically lowers our blood pressure, which is pretty amazing, but also reduces some of those stress hormones. So if you are, able to, in your household, give a hug, try to be totally present with that. Feel the experience of joy, the kind of feeling of relaxation that comes with that. Again, we're trying to get 1s or 2s. We're trying to kind of shift our focus, shift the way that we're thinking about things from these big emotions to what in the day is enjoyable. And that's in our control, because many of the things that we once enjoyed might not be available to us right now.
And I think that's so important, Kayla. And I know for me, I literally have to say to myself, okay, Sarah, you're going to put your stress over here away, and you're going to go for a walk, or you're going to put your stress, like I have to tell myself, but it works, because I think if we're not, it's about being mindful and conscious of it. Because if we're not, then the stress is just there taking over, and you aren't able, like you're saying, to enjoy that piece of chocolate or that hug or those little moments. So even if you have to tell yourself, okay, I'm putting my stress over here, I'm going to do this now. It's so important to be mindful and to kind of get back to that. So the other thing that I think that many people are experiencing through this idea of pandemic fatigue is, this feeling of feeling isolated and alone, and feeling like you just can't socialize even though you should. And this just is not for people that live alone. This is for people who are living in families, living with their partners, living with friends or roommates. Like, you can still live with other people and still be experiencing this kind of feeling of isolation. So it's really important, first and foremost, that you do what feels right for you, because we want people to feel safe, right, when they're socializing and interacting, but also to try to push yourself a bit to do something that once felt good, once did feel good, and was kind of energizing. I know that, recently I've spoken with several friends about being excited that the weather soon is going to kind of be getting more conducive to being outside, right? Which for me will make it easier to visit with friends and family. And just the idea of kind of talking about that, making future plans about that, really kind of, revved up my oxytocin, as you were talking about, Kayla, right? Like this idea of like, oh, I'm going to get to see people, and it's going to feel good to me because we can do it outside. So just making those future plans or the thought of being able to safely be around people can feel less isolating, right? It still might feel a little strange. You might have some anxiety around it, but just pushing yourself to think about that. It's so important to maintain your social support, or if you feel like you've lost it, which I think many have during the pandemic, to re-engage with that support, right? If you've kind of been isolating. So being around supportive friends and family, even, and I know we all have screen fatigue, but even if it's on FaceTime or Zoom, can help to combat the stress hormones that you were talking about, Kayla, right?
Mhm.
So that cortisol that happens when we're all stressed out, social connection negates that. It has that opposite effect, right? The oxytocin that you talked about, that helps us feel good. Um, so, as and we still have to wear masks and social distance and do all of those safe things. But I think we're at the cusp of, we're turning this corner where I think people will be able to more easily connect with each other. And I
Mhm.
think that's going to go a real long way for pandemic fatigue, is being able to connect with others. Um,
And I think, Sarah, one of the things that I've been hearing from people is that feeling that I haven't been a good enough friend. People must not like me anymore.
mm,
Whatever it is, we've all been experiencing this thing of feeling isolated, alone,
yes.
overwhelmed. I think one of the things is what I've been kind of challenging people to do is, where's the evidence, right? It text that person that you love and you feel connected to, and the hope is that you have a healthy enough and a strong enough relationship that they tell you if
Yes.
there was something that they were unhappy about, right? I think one of the things is, we can, if once we're so isolated and alone like we've been for so long, we can start to have these kind of, you know unhealthy thoughts, or these thoughts that might not be true about the world, that we then
Correct.
hold as truths. And so being really mindful that that can be happening for your interpersonal relationships. I haven't done enough. I'm not good enough. Where is that expectation coming from?
Right.
And challenge yourself to reach out, and hope that your friends, your family would let you know if they're feeling like they're not supported, when in fact most of the time I think people are just probably experiencing what you're experiencing, which is just
100%.
being so overwhelmed with their own experience of what's going on.
Yeah, we're all trying to do the best we can, right? So I think being kind to ourselves, being kind to others, and kind of, like you said, reach out and re-engage. I think we're on the cusp of turning the corner with COVID-19. So it's, I would challenge people to kind of re-engage how they can to combat that kind of social isolation. I do think, though, the best thing we can do, and this is the reason that we kind of brought this forth today, is to combat pandemic fatigue, is to know, right, the signs and symptoms. So to be aware of your stress level, to be aware of how you're coping, to be aware of how you are interacting with those around you, and to take action to really take care of ourselves. And I know we talk about this a lot, Kayla, on this stream, but it is so important to prioritize that, right? So basic things like staying hydrated. You mentioned getting fresh air, looking out the window, trying to be with nature when you can, you know, paying attention to your hygiene, eating healthy foods and nourishing your body. All of these things can make a big difference to combating this pandemic fatigue and the stress that is real, that we are all collectively experiencing.
Yeah. And I think I was reading something, Sarah, the other day, and I might be getting the name of it wrong, but I think it was forest bathing or nature
Oh,
bathing, Which is this idea. I mean, what's so cool is that we're studying so many things right now. But
Yes.
what the idea is that when we go out into nature, and we don't have to be like deep in nature, when we go and walk, in our neighborhoods, or we go to a park, or we try to see, I mean, in Rhode Island, we have so many options for beautiful, parks and places to kind of be in nature. We know that reduces our stress. It actually helps with things like depression and anxiety. Just doing 10 minutes or 15 minutes of being somewhere disconnected from our phones and kind of physically in nature, the more that we're spending time in nature, the better we feel, the better our physical health is. That doesn't mean we have to be running or climbing or like doing really like strenuous tasks to be to be helping our physical health. The idea of just being in nature helps our physical health. So it's just it's those little things. It's not the big things of self-care, the bubble baths, the spas that are really important. It's the little things that connect us back to ourselves and connect us back to nature that become so valuable right now in combating some of this, fatigue.
And the birds are chirping now. I'm starting to hear birds, and it's staying lighter out. Which those two things made me smile this week. So.
Yeah, here in Rhode Island, I think we're going to hit like 48 degrees today, which is basically spring for all of us. So.
Get outside.
Yeah. So we hope you found this informative and helpful. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2 Wednesdays, where we'll share information and ways to cope during COVID-19. Please remember that if you or a loved one is struggling during this time, please reach out for help. Now more than ever, it's important to pay attention not only to our physical health, but our emotional health as well. And if you can, take some time outside today. Thank you, and be well and be safe.
Bye, everyone.